Last week I told you I would be talking about the alternative Christian, and I'm subtitling this, Exploring the Heart of Enlightened Christianity. Because I have thought over the years about where do I personally stand with this whole notion of being a Christian. And it's something I want to try to explain today in a way that it's rather simple and it's rather complicated at the same time, because the explanation requires an understanding somewhat of what we are looking at when we're looking at our Gospels, in particular, actually the whole Bible, but I'm just going to focus on the Gospels. We'll be lucky to get through that. I'll try to let you out within 2 hours, but we'll see what happens here. But I've got a lot of material to cover, and I don't want to just cover material. I want to get an idea across. And that idea is that there are two levels of, there are two messages in our Gospels. There is a message from the early church, and there is a message, I think, from Jesus. So when I ask myself the question, am I a Christian? I would say I am definitely a follower of Jesus. Did the early church and the following Christian mainstream get his message? And I would say I don't think so. And that's the struggle that I have, that most of what passes as Christianity is probably not what Jesus taught. And I'll get into that here. That's a pretty bold statement, I realize. I consider myself a Christian, but I obviously don't flow with the mainstream. In this sense, I would compare myself with Jesus. Jesus was a Jew, but his greatest critics were the Jewish orthodoxy. And so we need to stop and think about that for a little bit. There are no indications whatsoever that Jesus tried to start a new movement, and he certainly didn't start one called Christianity. The earliest followers of the teachings of Jesus were simply called the followers of the way. And then there was the followers of the Jesus movement, I guess. They just called it the Jesus movement. And it was quite a bit later that they started calling it Christianity, based on the idea that he was the Christ, he was the expected Messiah in their eyes, and that he had come to fulfill the law, the expectations. And I want to get on that expectation here in just a moment. But when you think about what was Jesus, he never said he was anything other than a Jew. And yet the Jews hated him. And why is that? He was an alternative Jew. He was a Jew who looked into Judaism, into the heart of Judaism, and he found what I think we could characterize as the mystical thread. He was not interested in upholding ritual. He was not interested in washing before he ate, or not eating on the Sabbath, or working on the Sabbath, or he was not interested in the 600 plus rules that a good Jew had to follow in order to remain in good standing. He was interested in something deeper than that. And I think he understood quite well what it was. I don't know that the people around him did. But it is a spiritual thread, and actually when we go back into the Old Testament, we find that same spiritual thread that he was talking about. But that spiritual thread, which I'll define as truth, is what I base my faith on, my interest in the teachings of Jesus. That I see a mystical thread throughout the sayings attributed to him that is very much what I embrace, that God is centered in every one of us. And I think that's what Jesus was trying to say. And that all of the stuff that has grown up around that, the teachings that we call Christianity, mainstream Christianity, none of that really matters. And yes, we can get a lot of good out of that, and there are people that are drawn to it and are getting a lot of good out of it, but I want to associate with the Christian term, but give it a meaning that I think Jesus would have given it as well. And that may sound presumptuous, but as Paul said, the unspiritual man, which is the strict intellect, does not receive the gifts of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. And he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually or intuitively discerned. And I say the unspiritual man, I relate that to the strict intellect, because what we see in today our high priests are our scientists and our doctors, the medical profession and scientific community. And many of these folks, a large number of them, are openly atheists. They do not believe in anything relative to God. They reject a lot of the Christian tenets, the Jewish tenets and so forth, because they see the universe from a standpoint of law, in that, we can send a spaceship up to Mars, for example, which, as I've said, is an incredible thing. I mean, we all know that that's an incredible thing. Or the things that we're doing, that science is producing, are incredible. There's no question about it. And so the deeper that science looks into the way this whole universe works, the more they think they understand it, and the more they can do without this thing we call God. And I think what most of them are rejecting, and I can't speak for most of anybody, of course, but what I think people reject a lot of times is, what they reject is this: in the beginning God created the earth and all this, the whole universe in 6 days and all of that. I don't believe that. I reject that as a fact. I don't have any trouble understanding that that's what the Hebrew believed. And there's a reason that they're writing in this way. And I think instead of saying, let's just debunk it, let's say, that's what the early Hebrew believed. Is there something we can learn from that process, that creative process? And there is. But the unspiritual man, I relate it to the intellectual person who's just interested in the facts, interested in what you can see, weigh, measure, the scientific process. And yet I have a great deal of respect for that. But you cannot experience God from things. You have to jump off the material edge of the earth in order to have a spiritual experience. And many scientists do not think that we are any more than an activity of the brain, that we are so connected to the body that when the body dies, that's all there is. That's materialistic science. And of course, religion has always embraced the idea that we're something more than the body, that we are a soul that goes on. Goes on to where is the big question, but that we're more than that. But the intellect cannot get past this idea that if there is a living being, there must be a machine under it, a machine running the whole thing, and that's the physical body and all the neurons and all the electrons and the things that fire away in our bodies, that they try to understand thinking and all of this from this perspective, from things they can weigh and measure. So the unspiritual man, or the strict intellect, does not receive the gifts of the Spirit of God, the gifts of the Spirit of God, or the knowing that there is a deeper presence, an invisible reality, for their folly to him. And that's what we hear science saying. And he's not able to understand them because they are spiritually or intuitively discerned. And that's the problem. That's where the mystic comes in. The mystic is the intuitive. It's a person who has a well-developed intuitive faculty that is able to see beyond appearances, beyond the created world. We throw around a term metaphysics, and what that means is that it means beyond the physical. It means that we acknowledge that the source of all we see is invisible. It's beyond the physical, beyond the visible, beyond the physical. Yeah. The source of all that we see is an effect. It's the cause is unseen. So that is to get that is intuitive. And maybe you have not had a direct spiritual experience where you are absolutely convinced or absolutely know that this deeper level exists. You are an intellect that is turning to the intuition. Your intellect is becoming intuitive. You would represent, you would be what John the Baptist represents, the illumined intellect. The intellect that is illumined means the intellect that is becoming aware that there is a reality behind this visible plane. So that is apprehended intuitively. We cannot think it into expression. We can read books, we can do all the intellectual side of things, we can get some very good ideas and say, I'm a believer now. But we want to move beyond that. We want to move into an actual experience with His presence. We want to know God as our source, not as a theory. And so that's why Paul says this. The strict intellect, this doesn't mean anything to them. And what the strict intellect may likely do, if they are of a religious bent, is to go into a religion that, it's all laid out, tells them how to think and all of that. They may struggle with the idea of God being, this old man up in the sky that makes things, and I have struggled with that as well. But to say the unspiritual man is not a slap in the face, it's just a fact that there are people that get this and people that don't. And the people that tend to gravitate toward a teaching like unity are a minority. Christian mysticism is a fact that has run all through Christianity from the very beginning and before mysticism. But there are people that don't get it. They don't get that thread at all. They don't see it. It's all about ritual. It's all about, we get in fights and split churches over whether we dunk or sprinkle people, and just dogmatic. It's very creed-based, and it's unimportant to the mystic, to the one who gets the spiritual message. Jesus said, whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. I used to struggle with this idea because I would think of it in terms of what we have, money, things. Like, why would that be? Whoever, the rich get richer kind of thing. Why would Jesus be touting that? It makes no sense. But if you think of it from the spiritual level, it makes perfect sense. Whoever has an understanding of God as an inner presence will be given more. So an example of that would be, you start with that premise. God is within me, and you open the Bible and you read some of the things Jesus says, and some lights will come on. You'll be given more. You'll understand a deeper level of where He was coming from. But whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And that is the person who has no idea of this inner presence, this inner source that is God. The further you will get from that truth, you'll pick up a religion that talks all about Jesus coming someday in the future, or the sins of humankind, or all of the things that we get involved in, how wicked or sinful we are, and all the negative stuff. You'll tend to buy into that and get further away from this inner spark of truth. That's how I see that, and it makes perfect sense. And coming from the Jesus I believe that was speaking, that's what He was talking about. He wasn't talking about things. He wasn't talking about the rich get richer. He was talking about the spiritually rich. You tap into this secret, into this inner awakening. You have even a bit of it, and you will become richer. You will gain more with everything that you're exposed to, and you'll see it through your day. You'll see it through people. You'll see it through all kinds of ways. I just want to briefly talk about how the Gospels were developed, and I'm leaving the Gospel of John out because it was written around sometime after 90 A.D., probably around 100 A.D. or so, and it's not considered related at all to the first three Gospels, which are known as the synoptics, and that means that they're drawn from a similar source. So I'm not even going to talk about John. I'm not discounting John at all, because John is known as the spiritual gospel, and for very good reason. There's a ton of mystical insights all through that, and we'll get into that eventually here. But roughly speaking, Jesus was crucified around 27 A.D., Common Era, 27 CE. So the first writings to appear probably appeared somewhere between 50 to 60, 70 A.D. I should say 40 to 50, something like that. And that was what scholars think would be the Gospel of Thomas, would be one of them. And the other is a list of sayings. This is a theoretical speculation, but a list of sayings existed, known as the Q source. This was came from a German scholar that used the German word QL, which means source, so they just call it Q, the Q source. There was a list of sayings. The Gospel of Thomas is a list of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. It was known about but not fully discovered until 1945, and that is they had fragments of that gospel earlier. But in 1945, when they discovered the Nag Hammadi library, that was included in a Coptic form, which was copies of copies of copies, but it's still pretty accurate. And scholars were able to reconstruct the original Greek from that. But you had this other material that they're calling Q, and what it is, it's a list of sayings that you'll find in Matthew and Luke. They share those sayings, and so the scholars think that that's why, is there was this list of sayings floating around and these writers used them. So Mark was the first written. He didn't necessarily draw from these. He probably drew from, Mark was the first gospel written. I went over that kind of fast. In the Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but Mark technically is the first gospel. And again, scholars think that's true because Mark is included almost completely in Matthew and Luke. So they think Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources and also drew from this Q source. So Mark sits down after around 60 A.D. and writes this gospel. We don't know exactly when, and we don't even know that his name was Mark. All of the gospels are anonymous. All the original gospels are anonymous. The names were put on them later, drawn from information out of the gospels themselves. But Mark was hearing and was part of a community that was a follower of the Jesus movement. And there weren't too many people that could read and write, so it came to him, probably somehow inspired, to start collecting these sayings and these stories people are talking about. But we're talking, 30 years after the death of Jesus. You can imagine if we had a memorial service for someone that died 30 years ago. Probably very few here would know who that was, and would know how to even, maybe would hear a lot about them. So just imagine I'm Mark and I'm gathering all the information that you can give me on this person. There's a lot of rumors going around and so forth. So there's a lot I don't know as the writer. So I start with a list of what you say and I put it into narrative form. So it's acknowledged that the writers invented almost all of the narrative, all the stories that we see in the Gospels. And they gave those stories their interpretation. And by the time Mark wrote, the early church, and you can't really call it a church, this early movement had already formulated quite a bit of how they wanted to interpret Jesus, how they wanted to see him, and how they were using him, actually, to perpetuate their story. And I'm not making all this up. This is all very well-documented scholarly work. A scholar is a person who will take the scientific approach to how all this came about and not try to promote a religious point of view. What's important to remember, though, is Mark was promoting a religious point of view. Mark was an evangelist. He was not a historian. It's a very important thing to remember. And I'm just kind of laying this foundation. I hope I'm not confusing you too much, but it was not just, somebody didn't just sit down and write this stuff. God said, wakes this person up one day and says, okay, Mark, we need a gospel here. Get on this. It was put together as an evolution. And again, if we wrote something from a group like this that we're talking about, somebody that died 30 years ago, that was momentous, we would have probably not a real accurate picture of that person. When you think of that person themselves, that person when they were off by themselves thinking or reading a book or what inspired them or whatever. I mean, there's a whole life that we all live that nobody really knows about. And to think that we can find that Jesus, in our Gospels, it's so far removed from who the man was. And what's even more interesting, the earliest Gospels, copies of Gospels that are available to us, are copies that are 150 years away from the death of Jesus. 150 years passed before and that's the earliest Gospels they have, or the earliest writings they have. That doesn't mean that's the earliest writings, but they're gone, they're disintegrated. What we have is copies of copies of copies. And that would be a little bit like if you think of the Declaration of Independence when that was written, and then go up to 1950. That's the kind of spread we're looking at. So much happened, between those two dates, 1776, 1950. So you can imagine, without computers and without all the stuff that we have today, the Jesus that Mark was writing about probably only vaguely resembled the Jesus that walked and talked all over the place. But I think we have remnants of him. So the mystic stream of thought, which we find among the earliest aspects of Christian movement, centers on the practice of the presence of God. And I think this is what Jesus taught. I think this is what he was all about, and what the writers and mainstream Christianity totally has missed. I define truth, or I'm going to define truth in this series, as the omnipotence of God expressing as the spiritual essence of every individual. The full power of God is active in you. The full power of God is active in me. The full power of God is active in all. This is what I believe Jesus taught, and I'm going to support that with ideas as we go through this series. But truth is the omnipotence of God expressing as the spiritual essence of every individual. So we're starting with the understanding that I am already one with God, that I don't wait for God to come into my life, that God is already here. Why don't I see that? I think these are the questions Jesus is answering through parable, through a lot of it just his teachings. And we have to separate what the church taught from what he taught. And that's not too hard to do once we begin to see the mystical thread. And we start from this idea of God in me. The kingdom of God is within you. It's not low here, not low there. It's within you. It's in your midst. That is the primary principle, that if we view all of the Gospels through that idea, everything we read through that idea, we will see that echoed. It's often put in a different context, but you see that truth. You see it very clearly. That which you have, start with that understanding, you'll be given more. I would argue that the mystical experience represents the fundamental core of Jesus' teaching, the cornerstone rejected by the builders of mainstream Christian theology. I have no doubt that this is true in my own thinking. I mean, I have spent years studying what critical scholars say about this, and they pretty much wipe away this Jesus died for your sins, even the resurrection and all of this stuff. There is great truth in everything we read there. But if we focus only on the literal side of it, we miss the important thing, and that's what Jesus came to show, to teach. I think he came to tell people that God is within you, and I'm going to help you wake up to that. I'm going to show you some ways, some things that will help you wake up to that truth. And it will change your life. You know, if you're looking for change in your life, you're looking to make things better. This is how you do it. This is where you start. I'll talk next week about this idea of being born again. It falls perfectly into this whole idea. You have to be born again. You have to see yourself from a deeper place to understand who and what you are. And when you do that, when you begin to make that connection, you start seeing your whole life in a different way. You'll see the Bible certainly in a different way. Many of Jesus' sayings refer to the kingdom of God. He indicated this kingdom is spiritual in nature, is not something that can be observed. Don't you find it interesting that mainstream Christianity is standing out there looking up into the sky, waiting for Jesus to return? What is that? That's what they were doing in Acts. You know, they were standing up, looking up in the sky, and this angel comes by and says, "What are you looking at?" It's like, so when Paul wrote, he wrote from the perspective that Jesus is going to come back any day. And that was the whole thinking of the early church. He's going to come back any day. Well, he hasn't come back. And he's not going to come back. And if he came back, we'd kill him all over again, I think. Especially if he talked about the mystical thread, the inner kingdom. We're really no closer in understanding as a whole, as a collective, as a society than we were when he walked the face of this earth. I don't think. We're very externally oriented, and our belief in our science and our medicine, all that stuff, all of which is good, but we are discounting our own inner awakening. We have all these meditation seminars, we buy meditation tights, and we do all wear the right clothing and sit in the right posture and all of that. But I would wager that very few people actually touch that inner core that Jesus is talking about. But the moment we do, the moment we realize that he knew what he was talking about, the writers may not, and that's what I'm holding. Did the gospel writers grasp the mystical aspects of Jesus' teachings? I think the answer is no, they did not. Jesus was always chiding his disciples. You guys don't get what I'm saying. You've been with me all this time and you don't get it. He was talking about something they were thinking on a totally different level. They were waiting, looking at him as the Messiah that had come to overthrow the Roman Empire, to make their life better in the way the Jews were expecting, and that's still happening today. It's happening with the Jews and it's happening with the Christians. Two different versions of the same story. We're all waiting. And I think if he came back, he would say the same thing, that it's within you. It's not something you see, not something you observe. And I don't think Mark, Matthew or Luke got this. I think whoever wrote John got it. But he had nothing to do with Jesus. He came along way later. But there was a mystical tradition. Actually, John is derived from an earlier book, they believe, called the Book of Signs. And I haven't sat down and read through that yet, but I stumbled across that and it reminded me, so I'm going to pick that up. And a lot of these are online. They're free. You can download them and read the stuff. A lot of it's very boring to read. And some of the writings are very strange. If you have the Gospel of Thomas, there's some tremendous sayings in there. But there's some also very strange sayings. So you take it all with a grain of salt. We're talking about human beings that have written things down. And we all have different understanding of what those things are. I was talking to Elaine the other day about articles I'd written for Unity Magazine. She said she wanted a copy of them. I don't think I do. I don't think I want to go back and see what I used to believe, see what I wrote back then. It's I don't have them. I think I threw them all away. One time we were moving, and I thought, we don't need these. We don't need to carry these one more time, one more move, so I tossed them. Here's what I think happened. Fragments of the mystical element survive. We see gems of truth all throughout the sayings of Jesus. Not because the writers understood them, but because in their eyes, any one of these accumulated sayings were too precious to discard. You can imagine any one of these people with a list of sayings attributed to Jesus. They're not going to want to throw anything away. They may not understand what it's saying, just like I said just now. Some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, I don't know exactly what I would do with them if I was going to put them in a book, but I wouldn't throw them away. So I'd figure out something to do with them. So what Jesus, or what the writer would do, would take like the prodigal son, would take that story and would put it in light, or say the lost coin or the lost sheep, would put it in light of the lost wayward soul. And I don't think that's how Jesus would have talked about it at all. They would have used the saying, but they would couch it in a whole different meaning that had to do more with the church than with Jesus himself. In creating their narratives, the gospel writers did their best to incorporate all these sayings into their written works. In this way, the mystical thread was inadvertently and even haphazardly preserved without acknowledgement or any type of systematic form. In other words, they're kind of random. These sayings, these gems show up in this matrix of church teachings. If you have the eyes to see, you'll see it. If you have, more will be given to you. If you don't have, you'll pass right over them. You'll see them as a moral lesson rather than a mystical representation. Like the parable of the good and bad fish, we're left to pluck this thread from the works of these writers whose clear intent was to represent Jesus as the harbinger of a very observable kingdom that could come at any moment. And that kingdom is not going to come, it's already here. As Thomas says, the kingdom of God, the Pharisee said, when's it coming? The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and men do not see it, he said. And I think that's it. It's spread out upon the earth, but it's within us primarily. So just to recap here, and I kind of rushed through all this, but there was a lot. There exists a strong thread of mysticism in the teachings of Jesus. This is what I latch on to when I say I'm a Christian. This is the heart of what I latch on to. And we'll go over these through these coming weeks. Mainstream Christianity misses this important element. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't agree with mainstream Christianity. I don't agree with the interpretation they give to Jesus. I don't agree with that. But I'm not going to throw Jesus out with it, because I think there is a powerful thread of messages here that we need to look at and that we can found ourselves on. We can say, this is what I believe and why. It's up to us to discern the thread of truth embedded in our gospel accounts. So people like me will throw ideas out to you, and you can take them or leave them, however you want. But It's a sad thing to me. And you see, this is not just true with Christianity. It's true with Hinduism. It's true with Buddhism. There's an orthodox level of all of it. It's like the low-hanging fruit, as I said in the back of the program. It's what's easy to grasp. Okay, tell me what I believe. Tell me what to think. And so, here it is. But what does that have to do with going into my inner closet, shutting the door, praying to the Father who is in secret? That's a profound statement. That's the way that we're looking for. And it's right here. It doesn't cost anything. You don't have to take lessons, but you do have to be patient. And we'll talk about that. Okay. All right. Thanks for coming out. And this actually could be called alternative Christianity, enlightened Christianity, I think is a better word for it. But I'm going to stay with the term alternative Christian just because I started with it. All right.